Hello and welcome to Energy Unplugged by Aurora. This podcast features various experts from Aurora having in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, policymakers and academics from all over the world. It explores the hottest topics across the energy market and gives a unique perspective on major energy issues.
Welcome to Energy Unplugged. I'm Hugo Batten, Managing Director of Aurora in APAC and California. We're very much looking forward to today's discussion, which is going to be focused on Japan's energy markets. Today's guest is Professor Llewelyn Hughes of the Australian National University and a deep expert in Japan's energy markets. Llewelyn's had a long and distinguished academic career, spending time at MIT, Tokyo University, and Harvard. He's also currently the director of the Japan Institute at ANU. He's also spent time in government as an advisor to Ichirō Ozawa, Liberal Party of Japan, and the private sector, for example, Enron in Japan, as well as providing strategic and regulatory advice to energy companies operating in the Japanese energy market. Welcome, Llewelyn.
Thanks, Hugo. It's great to be with you.
We're also joined today by Aurora's Rowan von Spreckelsen, who leads Aurora's entry in new markets across APAC, and who'll be chatting to Llewelyn with me. Welcome, Rowan.
Hey, Hugo. Thanks for having me.
Let's dive right in then. Llewelyn, we've done a couple of podcasts on Japan's power markets, but there's obviously a lot going on. For our non-Japanese listeners, can you talk a little bit about the evolution of Japan's power market over the last 5 years or so? And, very conscious it's been quite a long road to deregulation and to try and create greater competition.
Thanks so much, and it's great to be with you here today. I wanted to start a little bit further back in time, if I could. As you mentioned, I got started really in Japan power markets in around 2000 when I was hired by Enron into their Tokyo office as part of a small team to try and push forward the liberalization of Japan's power, gas, and telecoms markets, if you might believe it. You might remember that Enron was hoping to trade 30-minute increments of broadband back in the day. And from that perspective, often people say that Japan's quite slow to change. But, to me, it's really clear that we've seen some very substantial reforms in Japan's power sector over that longer time period. It's worth remembering the legacy that Japan started with. Actually, part of Japan's post-war anti-monopoly drive in 1950 during the occupation saw the management of the grid broken into 9 regional utilities outside Okinawa. And we really had that system sitting in place, that is vertically integrated regional monopolies within the service areas for more than 4 decades, right? So change really began in the 1990s, and that happened because Japanese policymakers accepted the view, I think, that power prices were too high relative to the OECD. So when I worked at Enron, we had a banner on the website saying that they were some hundreds of % higher than the average OECD prices, for example, and that the best response to that was to relax the rules around access to generation and retail markets. That was really part of the zeitgeist as well, I guess, at the time in the 1990s. And so what we've seen since then is a pretty long process of adapting to that new market model. The model is pretty common and familiar probably to your listeners. That is liberalizing the competitive segments of the power sector, that is generation and retail, separating out transmission and distribution from those competitive segments. Now, there's obviously a huge amount of other things that are going on, new approaches to transmission planning, which we might touch on later, the creation of additional markets to serve the electricity sector, enabling new types of generation like offshore wind come in, but that's the kind of the overall picture.
Yeah, it's a really interesting point. I mean, deregulation and privatization, in some markets it went, I think, relatively smoothly and relatively quickly. But in other markets, it did take more time and kind of in fits and starts. I think California is a great example where it almost got midway through some of their deregulation pushes, and then they had some energy crisis in the early 2000s, in part driven by Enron, but, and then kind of almost paused at a certain stage of the deregulation journey. So, yeah, it is an acute observation that they take different lengths of time and are not always completely linear.
Yeah, look, I don't know. Although, I mean, the California crisis in 2001, I remember pretty well because I was at Enron at that time, and it was used, pretty strongly to argue to slow down liberalization of power markets. I remember that pretty well. I think with the case of Japan, rather than being fits and starts, it's rather that it's been a fairly slow phased approach. So if you look at generation, for example, we began in the mid-90s with independent power producers gaining access to the ability to sell or to build generation and sell. On the retail side, really beginning in I think it was in 2000, we had extra high voltage users, so big factories and department stores and so on being opened up to retail competition. But that took until 2016 for residential customers to be able to choose who they might buy power from. So, that was always conceived of as a phased effort, but it was done over a fairly lengthy period of time. And so, rather than kind of fits and starts because of crises, I think it's probably more that they've just kind of taken their time to make each step was locked in and bedded down before you moved on to the next one.
Just out of interest, is that consistent with other Japanese, major policy overhauls? Does it tend to be a little bit longer, more considered, more deliberate than perhaps, I don't know, Australia or the UK or elsewhere?
Gee, that is a great question. I think I sort of think as power being of a kind, on its own, if you like, and the reason for that is it's just so core to the economy for a start.
Yeah.
And the Japanese government certainly for a long time has been really focused on issues like energy security, given the long supply chains, for example, you've had to enable fuels to come into the economy more broadly. So I think that, energy planning, if you like, has been just a really central and almost set apart from other deregulation processes. Although, look, certainly in the 80s, there's a long history of, trade disputes with the US around access to the construction market, telecoms markets, and so on and so forth. And there are certainly lots of warriors from back in the day in the 80s and the 90s who engaged in those trade negotiations who would probably say, in response to your question, that yes, Japan can take time to do things. It's not unreasonable in power markets because the risks are big if you get it wrong, of course.
Yeah, absolutely. So Japan's energy market, like a lot of energy markets over the last 12 months, has been under stress. Very high gas prices, creating high electricity prices, supply chain and capex issues around renewables and storage and difficulty building transmission have created high wholesale prices, which have put retailers under stress. How are Japanese policymakers responding, I suppose, to the last 12 months? In Europe, we saw fairly radical proposals around decoupling green and thermal wholesale markets. I haven't seen anything like that being discussed in Japanese power policy circles, but you're much closer to them than I have. What's been the general response of policymakers?
Yeah, look, definitely, Japan has seen, large increase in, fuel prices, imports, which is going into the power sector. We've had a weakening yen, which has meant that the import bill has been large, and that's put pressure under their former utilities. I did see, for example, that TEPCO took some emergency funding from a consortium of banks to help them deal with the fact that you've got both a weakening yen and increasing gas prices and so on. So there's been a lot of turbulence over the last 12 months, no doubt about it. I would say, though, that we haven't seen any real reconsideration of the fundamental direction that we're seeing power market regulation go. Having said that, I think that there's probably, one thing that's worth pointing to is this new GX or green transformation policy, which the government's trying to bed down. And that's a whole package of different policies. But one of the things that they're looking to do through this GX or green transformation package is to reconsider the role of nuclear power within Japan's electricity mix once again. We've been in a holding pattern around what position nuclear power would take within the Japanese power system, really since the Fukushima nuclear disaster. And as a result of this turbulence that we've seen, I think that there's been a kind of move to reconsider and re-enable really the role of nuclear power. I just think that the dynamics of the Japanese power market are a little bit different to Europe. Yes, the volatility and so on, but the kind of things which have been shocked, have shocked the system, a little bit different, and obviously absolutely dominated by the Fukushima nuclear disaster of 2011. So if you wanted to think about a big exogenous shock, which changed the direction of energy planning within Japan, it really happened, 10 plus years earlier with the Fukushima nuclear disaster. If you look at the basic energy strategy, which is the Japanese cabinet has to review the midterm energy settings for Japan every 3 years. That's called the Basic Energy Strategy or BES. In 2010, just before the nuclear disaster, the government was looking at nuclear being about up to 50% of generated electricity by 2030, and that was a core part of meeting energy security goals and a core part of that of the decarbonisation agenda at the time. A year later, that went to zero. And so we've really been, I think in a kind of holding pattern for quite a long time. Over the last 12 months, that's changed. So under this new GX or Green Transformation suite of policies, they're a little bit of an answer to the Inflation Reduction Act brought out by the Biden administration. Also, there's kind of industrial policies being brought out within Europe. There's a whole range of different packages, parts of that package, but the long-standing legislated rule for nuclear power was to enable 40-year operating life in principle with a one-time extension of 20 years allowable if those units met safety standards. And the roadmap which the government has brought out, this is going to require legislative change, is around allowing those nuclear units which have been shuttered to be extended beyond that period of time. There's also a bunch of R&D in there about next generation nuclear units, right? And kind of statements around potentially building those and deploying them within Japan. So I think you have seen a bit of a pushback of nuclear into consideration for long-term planning around generation in Japan. And that's been triggered a little bit by the kind of volatility that you're describing. But yeah, as I said, the big exogenous shock which changed the direction of planning, really was the Fukushima nuclear disaster and what that meant for decarbonization plans, reliability, all those kinds of questions.
One final question before I hand over to Rowan. There are very few gentailers, vertically integrated utilities who have, completely nailed the energy transition. And certainly some of Japan's big utilities have been under stress. How would they, broadly speaking, how are they responding to these domestic policy shifts? And I'm talking here about the likes of TEPCO, obviously.
Yeah, look, it's a great question. When I got started looking at the Japanese electricity sector, the utilities were utterly dominant, right? Like if you wanted to know, the direction of policy, you needed to pay really close attention to the Federation of Electric Power Companies, or FEPC, which was the industry association of the utilities themselves. They really represented the industry at large. That picture looks quite different today. Now, I will say that there continue to be market power issues within Japan, right? On a capacity basis within generation, the former utilities have about 80% of generation on a capacity base. That's mostly more emissions intensive, fixed point, large scale generation assets. They also have got a big share of the retail market. And importantly, there's not a lot of competition across the former service areas. And this is something actually that the government's been looking at quite closely recently as well. But they have been needing to adapt. So the first thing, obviously, to say, let's point back to Fukushima. There's an enormous nuclear plant there which has to be decommissioned. There's a really very difficult problem around the fuel which is sitting at the bottom of the containment vessel, enormously expensive and a decades-long process to try and manage that. A lot of the technology that's going to enable that to be managed, hasn't yet been invented. Right? So this is kind of a core thing to keep in mind when you're thinking about how particularly TEPCO is responding to the sets of changes that we've seen. So we've seen, with the market changes, we've seen transmission separated out from retail and generation, right? So we've seen a change in the structure of the utilities themselves, either moving to subsidiary or to holding company structures. I think one of the most interesting things that's happened in Japan actually is the creation of JERA, right? So JERA is a new entity. It's a 50-50 venture between TEPCO and Chubu Electric, with all the thermal assets of those two companies folded into it. But it feels like quite a different company to the former utilities. It's not tied to a particular service area like the old vertically integrated companies, might have that as part of their corporate culture. You probably saw a couple of months ago that JERA bought Parkwind, which is Belgium's, I think, their largest offshore wind generator over there. And you would have seen probably last week that they also just bought Green Power Investment, which was one of Japan's biggest, if not the biggest, renewable developer within Japan as well, which is a really huge move. I mean, GPI is, a great company and a very capable company. So, you've seen kind of JERA emerge into the marketplace as a really new entity. So I think that, as I said at the beginning, looking back from that longer time scale, that looks like quite a different picture to the picture that I used to see when I was sitting at a desk as as an associate or whatever it was back in the Enron days. There's internationalization, there's some investment in renewables, but we do still have the market power issue around generation and around retail, which continues to be a feature of the Japanese market.
Llewelyn, I wanted to maybe come in here and touch on something you mentioned earlier around kind of the development of some of the new markets as a response to some of these changes, and dive into a bit more detail on that kind of market design question and what does the current landscape look like in Japan. To date, a lot of the kind of renewable capacity has been deployed on the back of long-term feed-in tariffs, and that's now has been replaced with feed-in premiums. There's also the introduction of the carbon price coming on, a low carbon 20-year subsidy for capex. You mentioned earlier that Japan tends to take a longer considered view to implement changes, but it feels like things are starting to speed up on the market design side of things. What do you think about some of these new structures? Is there a risk that we're starting to change too quickly, or is it actually best to do these reforms all in one go?
So to come to your question, you're right that there's an enormous amount going on. And as I mentioned, we've got this green transformation package of policies which have also been put in place, which are talking about carbon pricing, as well, a whole bunch of industry policy initiatives which are going to require a lot of deep analysis. I think the particular challenge Japan faces is that it's trying to do two things at once. One of them is to complete the process of introducing competitive principles into the electricity market. And at the same time, the government, along with other governments, has substantially increased the ambition of its decarbonisation targets. And that really importantly is not just mid-century, but also this 2030 near-term target of a 46% economy-wide emissions reduction compared to 2030. So intuitively, it makes sense, I guess, that you would want to do the market design stuff before you think about the decarbonisation part of things. But I don't know that we've got a lot of evidence, coming from the research perspective about whether the pace of reform is going to affect the likelihood of success. For me, it's really about, what are you trying to achieve? What policies are you using to do it, and how are they importantly interacting with one another? So, the government is really focused on system reliability. As you mentioned, we've got a capacity market, we've got balancing markets which are being put in place as well. We've got this new kind of longer term subsidy which the government is putting in place to enable to try and ensure that there's sufficient long-term generation being invested in. But aside from that system reliability issue, really, we've got near-term rapid decarbonisation, and then we've also got the goal for economic efficiency. I think that there's risks to both of those things, but I don't know it's because of the pace of reform. And this is really a personal view, but I think it has something to do with a difference in the underlying vision that's driving some of the changes that we're seeing. There have been a lot of not a lot, but there've been quite a number, I guess, of independent scenarios which have been developed outside government looking at pathways to decarbonisation of Japan recently. There was a big study that came out from Berkeley and Enron, led by Shiraishi Kenji recently, which got quite a bit of media, pointing out that it's possible for Japan to move to a 90% decarbonised power system by 2030 without coal and without any new LNG invested in. The Renewable Energy Institute's, an independent think tank in Japan, they've done a similar kind of analysis. And those kinds of analyses are a little bit of odds with what we're seeing coming out of government planning processes. If you take the example of hydrogen and ammonia, that is a fairly core part of the Japanese government's plans for reducing emissions from the power sector in the long run. And, that's been criticized as risky and possibly costly and quite possibly inconsistent with long-run emission goals. So I don't know, whether that difference is just because of the speed of reform. Rather, I do sort of feel that there's a bit of a difference in the philosophy or what the feasibility space looks like for decarbonisation in Japan, which is leading to some concern that you're going to meet your decarbonisation goals, that you're going to be able to do it at lowest cost, that you're not relying on some innovation which hasn't yet been achieved yet and is necessarily uncertain, right? And the outcome, of course, if you don't get that right, is you're going to end up with more emissions-intensive capacity in the system for longer, which is going to undermine your long-term decarbonisation plan. So I think that's a risk, right?
I mean, just to build on that a little bit, it's interesting how rare fully integrated reform packages in energy markets are. I think this kind of suite of reforms, EMR in the UK was an example where it actually did come together, simultaneously carbon prices, capacity market, sharpening signals in the wholesale market. But and maybe the New South Wales roadmap for our Aussie listeners is another one where transmission, renewables, firming was all tackled together. But it does feel like most jurisdictions struggle to do that. And it is more kind of gradual incremental change responding to particular crises as they emerge. It'd be interesting, as you say, I'm not sure what the academic literature is on this, Llewelyn, but it'd be interesting to kind of compare, centrally planned and driven integrated reform packages to more kind of incremental reforms and which have more success in the long run, however you define success.
Well, I think that's right. And I mean, the other thing to say, I guess, about this is, there's a generally accepted view that if we set an appropriate carbon price, then that's going to achieve the main goals that we try and achieve through market design, right? We want something to be environmentally effective, that is to decarbonize as we're talking about it today. You want it to be cost effective. You want to be able to deal with the distributional issues associated with transition, right? And the carbon tax can be good in that sense, because you can take the revenues from it and redistribute those in order to manage any kind of energy justice related concerns that you might have. The big issue, of course, is it hasn't proven itself to be politically feasible in many jurisdictions to be able to introduce at what's recognized as the kind of social cost of carbon to us, right? And so what you end up with is policy packages, right, which really kind of try to knit together a whole variety of different approaches to solving the decarbonization problem. And Japan is in a particularly difficult position here, right? It is a large electricity market, right? It's not connected to the Asian continent, right? So you don't have any kind of options with other countries to trade power. It's a fairly small place. It's very mountainous, and it's got a constrained grid because of the legacy issues that we saw before. So I do kind of sympathize with people who are trying to figure this particular problem out. I think they're burning the midnight oil quite a bit. They've got market design issues to think about. They've got this really ambitious new decarbonization agenda that they're trying to implement. That requires new generation types to come into the market. But also, you've got to be pretty careful about the market design, right? Otherwise, you could end up with problems with insufficient investment in the long term, for example, in generation. So it is a difficult set of initiatives to implement in general. And I think that Japan does face some particular challenges given its geography, and the size of the market as well.
The other one I point to is this very steep shoreline as well. So even offshore wind is challenging in Japan, and a significant chunk of it may have to be floating. So I think Japan's real physical geographic challenges certainly put, for example, Australia's decarbonisation challenges into context.
I think you both touched on several of the kind of key challenges in Japan there. I wanted to unpack those and get a bit more into the weeds on a few of those topics. I think primarily you touched on nuclear, Japan and hydrogen, offshore wind at the end there. I think transmission's the other big one. So wanted to maybe dive into each of those in turn. Maybe let's start with transmission. Like a lot of markets, I think Japan is starting to see material grid curtailment in certain regions. It's probably one of the number 2 issues that we model with developers. Do you have views on kind of how best to accelerate transmission build out across Japan? Are there kind of governments around the world that are doing this well?
Yeah, so it's a really great question. Actually, there are a few areas where I think Japan has been doing a pretty good job. Energy efficiency is generally recognized as one of those. It's got this kind of long-standing law, the Energy Efficiency Act, which has been using kind of standard setting around manufacturers across a whole range of different product categories to help improve energy efficiency across the economy generally. That's been pretty successful, and they're looking to squeeze a lot more out of that in the coming decades as well. They've done a pretty good job of that. I think that transmission is actually another fairly bright spot in terms of Japan's decarbonization planning, although that may be underappreciated because often this is kind of discussions which are happening, in the weeds amongst these subcommittees sitting within the ministry, and the information doesn't always come out very clearly to market participants. So, a key change here, again, it goes back to Fukushima, right? So back with Fukushima, in the wash up from that disaster, there's kind of analysis of what went wrong in the power sector. And one of the things that was identified was limited regional interconnections, right? Which is just a legacy of the former utility structure. So in 2015, we had this new organization created, OCTO, or the Organization for Cross-Regional Coordination of Transmission Operators, I think is what it's called, although I often have to look that up because OCTO is much, much easier to say. And one of its roles is to formulate and develop cross-regional network development plans, right? Now, one of the things that it's done is develop a national grid plan. And they actually looked at the Europeans quite a bit in terms of scenario planning around grid, and particularly the ENTSO-E process, as they thought about how you should think about grid planning for Japan. I would really encourage listeners to take a look at that work if they want to understand how Japan's kind of thinking about grid build out, right? So we had a legacy system in which, when you thought about strengthening the grid, it really got triggered by requests to connect by new generators, and that could really slow the new generators, including renewable generators, or access to the grid. But what we've seen is that shift to a national grid planning process where there's a cost-benefit analysis associated with new investments. Scenarios have been developed. I think there were 3 of them from memory, with the central scenario seeing more substantial renewables penetration, up to, I think, around 50%. And there's certainly been criticism that should be more. But then we've seen an analysis of the range of investments which would be identified as consistent across all the scenarios, depending on how generation develops in the coming decades, right? And those investments have been identified both within the former utility service areas in Kyushu and elsewhere, as well as between them, and crucially between Hokkaido and Tohoku as well as this high voltage DC cable that they're doing a feasibility study on to link Hokkaido down to the Tokyo area. So, we've kind of moved from the system in which you had grid enhancements being triggered by requests for access by new generators to a much more integrated national grid planning process in which we're seeing the feasibility studies beginning to be done around actual new grid investments between the regions in order to enable power to flow from places where you can have a lot of renewables built, particularly here I'm thinking about the north of Japan around Hokkaido and Tohoku, down into the major demand centers, around Tokyo. So there's definitely, been some criticism, I guess, of the size of the investments which have been suggested there. So if you look at the 90% renewables deployment scenarios, for example, they suggest you would need more grid investment up in the north than is being planned under the national grid planning process. But it is really heartening, and I think an excellent change, to see a shift to national grid planning, and to real actual cases being developed around the investment in those. Now, let's go back to the 46% economy-wide emissions reduction target again. Would it have been better if we had the national grid planning process, kind of settled a few years ago? In retrospect, that's probably the case, right? Because, we've got these near-term goals, 2030 goals, and there's a lot to get done. But it's a kind of direction of change. I do think that the changes that we've seen in transmission have come, taken a pretty big step in a fairly short period of time. And I would really point to that as one of the bright lights of the changes that we've seen in Japan.
Yeah, we spent a lot of time looking at that Octo master plan that you were talking about, and I think it is something that we've seen grid operators globally start to really pick up the pace on and be very proactive with long-term planning. Sure. It's the major thing that can unlock the grid. It's often one major area that government can really have a major role in kind of dedicating spend to the grids, making sure that they're coordinating with the grid operators and the utilities to facilitate that and bring on renewables to meet their targets.
That's one of the interesting things about it too, is that, here I'm sitting in Australia, and, in Australia, there's, this is a conversation that we're having with the renewable energy zones, and, how we're going to build transmission grids, between Victoria and South Australia and other jurisdictions, for example. One of the issues that we often, that we're concerned about is kind of societal acceptance of the building of these large new transmission grids, right? This is a how to pay for it question, but I think a really fundamental question is around areas where there's a lot of agriculture and getting access to that to build new transmission lines, for example. One of the things I don't hear a lot about in Japan, is that kind of societal acceptance associated with new transmission build type question. I don't know if that's because it's not a question or just because we don't read a lot about it, but I think it's an issue that would be interesting to look into in a little bit more detail. It may just be that, given locational choices, that's less of a concern around population centers, right? We've got a highly urbanized society in Japan, right? So maybe that's what's going on. I'm not quite sure, but it's not something that you see discussed, I guess, in the Japanese market to the same degree that you might see elsewhere. I'm thinking also of Germany, where that's been a big issue.
Yeah, and some degree, again, my understanding of depopulation in some of the rural areas as well as Japan's population declines over time. So maybe that's another driver there. But agree, super interesting topic.
It could be, but it comes down to, I guess, now when we're looking at the actual, we've got the national grid plan. We can see what the early business cases are for these new investments. Now we're getting down to detailed planning around those. The locational choices are going to be made, and I guess if you're going to start to see some kind of pushback, that's the point where you're likely to see that happen.
It's probably worth touching on the nuclear picture in the context of challenges to decarbonisation as well. And it's such a major factor long term. What's your take on the kind of restart sequence of Japan's nuclear fleet? The official target is 30 to 33 gigawatts by 2030. Do you think they'll achieve that, and generally, how are you seeing the population and general public kind of responding to that, the kind of safety versus decarbonisation dilemma?
So I thought you might ask about nuclear, and I sort of feel like if I knew whether they were going to reach the capacity or at least the energy target by 2030, I could have made some investments and probably be retired about if I truly knew the answer to that question. But I think the fundamental reason for that is because what's constraining nuclear restarts in Japan, has become a quite difficult process which is really centered around a new independent regulatory agency, right? So historically, Japan has not had a lot of independent regulatory agencies. I think I'm right in saying the first one of these really was the Financial Supervisory Agency, which was created in 2001. But prior to that, you often had the regulation and the policy making going on within the same entities within government, right? So, the independent regulatory agency model is something that really, I think, it kicked off really, beginning with the FSA. So now we've got the Nuclear Regulatory Agency, which was created in the wake of the nuclear disaster, hived off from the central ministry, and it's put in place some pretty stringent safety regulations associated with restarts, and it's been pretty independent in making those decisions. And so they've been looking, for example, at historical data around the existence of fault lines close to, and really going along many hundreds, if not thousands of years back in time to take a look at that. They've also been looking at other kinds of safety issues, the kinds of procedures which have been put in place to manage the threat of potential terrorist incidents, for example. And that is a very, very time-consuming and also uncertain process, right? So TEPCO for a long time has been really wanting to restart Units 6 and 7 of the Kashiwazaki Kariwa nuclear plant out there in Niigata, while shutting down Units 1 to 5, which are older units. But they've been unable to do so, and part of the reason for that is because of the independent regulatory process which has been put in place in the wake of Fukushima. The other part of it is around local support. So, Hugo, you I think mentioned earlier that how Japanese public is responding to the nuclear and thinking about the nuclear issue. So I would say really from about the kind of I took a look at the 2014, if you look at the 2014 general election, for example, right, that to me, nuclear was really quite inoculated as a political issue at the national level. And what I mean by that is the government had kind of settled on a position in which it would say, we're going to need to keep nuclear to a certain degree, but we're not going to build new nuclear. And actually what it suggested is that nuclear would attenuate within the overall power mix over time, right? But we need to keep it for reliability reasons as well as for decarbonization. The general population elections, if you look at opinion polls that say, nuclear is not particularly popular, but you also haven't seen the government which has taken the position of keeping it to some degree in the energy mix being punished at the ballot box, right? So this is quite different from, let's say, Germany, where you've got these kind of parties sitting within the parliament at the national level who have got very explicit positions and they're winning political support in order, to get nuclear out of the energy mix, for example. That's really not the situation you have in Japan. You haven't got the equivalent of a Greens party in Japan, which is in coalition and kind of pushing those kinds of outcomes. So I'd say nationally, it's been a pretty benign environment in that particular sense. But the other big constraint and uncertainty, I guess, more importantly, has been around local politics, right? So, although it's not legislated, it's intuitively obvious, I guess, that the national government doesn't want to push or support restarts in the face of strong opposition locally, and you've seen that play out in local politics, right? So in Niigata, for a long time, there was a governor who was less than positive, might be one way of putting it, towards restarting the Kashiwazaki Kariwa plant. We've had a change in governor, but he's stepping very carefully in terms of thinking through those issues. So, when I say uncertainty, I think there's kind of true uncertainty here, right? You really can't assign a probability to when particularly the local conditions are likely to shift. And then you also have a fairly lengthy period around potentially meeting the new safety standards which are required in order to restart nuclear power plants. So it does become really, really uncertain. The question is, what happens if those plants don't restart? What's the likely outcome going to be for Japan's decarb goals, as we spoke about a little bit earlier. And that's where I guess energy system modeling comes into play, right? You can look at different scenario analyses for these and understand what's likely to pick up the slack. I mean, if I was to wet my finger and put it in the air, I would say it's a mix of gas and some coal and probably some solar, but it's not going to be particularly good in terms of these very ambitious 2030 emissions reduction targets that we see. But probably the best way to think about that is indeed in terms of some scenario analysis.
Yeah, and I think the government is doing a reasonably good job of looking at the other options. I think it knows that the nuclear restart is an uncertainty. So I think in the context of thinking about CCS on its gas and coal plants, looking at hydrogen and ammonia, and also the deployment of the offshore wind industry as well, so that you're not entirely dependent on one technology type through that period. It'd be worth touching briefly on the hydrogen and ammonia side of things.
Yeah.
Japan has positioned itself as a central kind of import region for Japan, whether it's from Australia or the Middle East or the US or South America.
Yeah.
What's the right strategy here? Kind of let exporters invest, pick winners, or instead develop deep relationships with a couple of countries and kind of co-develop infrastructure?
So, I think that hydrogen and ammonia it's really important to talk about when you're thinking about where Japan is at today. If I look at this debate around hydrogen, over the last 5 years, let's say, Japan was, I think, the first government to release a national hydrogen strategy, right, back in 2017, I want to say it was. And, IRENA now has kind of catalogued all of the national hydrogen strategies that have been released. There are quite a number of them now. I know that the Australian national hydrogen strategy, for example, really came off the back of the Japanese one because the Australian government saw there was a potential export, and industry saw there's a potential export opportunity there. In the kind of end use cases around Japan's national hydrogen strategy as well, and we've alluded to this before, there's the kind of suggestion of the use of hydrogen and ammonia within the power sector, which is not broadly being considered in other markets, right? So, we're thinking about hard to abate sectors, steel in particular, as a core end use case for hydrogen, but not in these other areas in which direct electrification is likely to be more cost competitive and easier to do and rely less on uncertain innovation, right? So, the other area, I guess, is fuel cell vehicles, which is still, kind of big push within Japan, which, many people say is not likely the direction that market is going. So, Japan does have bullish plans for hydrogen and ammonia, including in the power sector, right? Now, how they gone about doing this, I think that actually, as you mentioned, both things are going on. That is, in 2022, I think it was February, JERA released a request for proposals, right? And they asked for bids from a number of different companies to supply 500,000 tons a year, I think, of ammonia on a long-term contract, right? While giving them the option to actually take a position in the upstream project itself. Now, my understanding is that's tied to its plan to switch to 20% of the fuel load for one particular unit on a particular plant. Now switch it to ammonia for co-combusting with coal, beginning in the late 2020. So they've kind of gone with this idea of a request for proposals, right? Let's let exporters invest and then pick the cheapest and take an option to be able to invest upstream if we like the look of the project which is being developed. There's the question, of course, on the exporter side about how much certainty that, whether that gives you sufficient certainty to make those investments, right? But we have also seen, as the Australian government's done as well, much more of this kind of co-development of infrastructure type plan as well. So in the National Hydrogen Strategy, up to 2025 is kind of designated this period for testing different technologies for transport in particular. So there's likely to be domestic manufactured hydrogen, but given the quantum of hydrogen / ammonia that Japan wants to use, they're talking about importing a lot, and so I mean, Australia in Victoria, we've got this project. There are other projects around which are looking at different energy carriers for hydrogen. So you're seeing that as well, and in that you've seen Japanese companies like J-Power, for example, investing upstream internationally in those assets, right? So I think both those things are going on. The big question, of course, is where hydrogen, ammonia end up in the final picture of Japan's decarbonisation trajectory. There are these market segments in which direct electrification is kind of understood as possibly being the cheaper and more feasible option. And so it gets back to the point I was making before about this kind of philosophical difference, if you like, about what the range of feasibility looks like for Japan in terms of deep decarbonisation.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the other one in the infrastructure kind of investment outlook is also the question on the offshore wind. A similar structure as hydrogen. You've got to do a lot of port investment ahead of time if that's something that they want to do. Well, and we'd probably be remiss if we didn't talk about offshore wind briefly.
Yes.
But I'll maybe squeeze that in as the last question before we wrap up. What's your take on the offshore wind auctions to date? Do you think we will hit the target, the 10 gigawatts by 2030, or do you think too ambitious?
Look, so the first thing to note about the 10 gigawatt target by 2030 is the target for projects under development, right, rather than actually supplying electricity to the market. And so, if you look at what the government is actually thinking about, if they're as ambitious as possible, it's a much smaller number of gigawatts, I think 5.7 gigawatts or something like this, with additional policy put in place that would be operating in the market. So it's not going to play a significant role in the 23 electricity mix, for example, right, as part of the more ambitious decarbonisation targets. But look, I'm hopeful and ambitious for offshore wind in Japan. I spend quite a bit of time looking at the offshore wind sector. One of the issues that they've had is they've built a process for allocating development zones where you hold auctions in these rounds that you're describing has been a pretty bottom-up process to date, right? And what that has meant is a lot of pre-negotiation with fishing communities, particularly. And fishing communities look pretty different in different parts of Japan, how they're organized and so on. So I think that we mentioned before about the geographic or geophysical constraints of decarbonization in Japan. Steep continental shelf was one of the things that was mentioned. The framework legislation was put in place in Japan was up to Japan's, about 12 nautical miles, I think it is, from shore. But they've recently started talking about enabling development in Japan's exclusive economic zone, which would move much further offshore, and that obviously would enable floating offshore to a much greater degree than we've seen. The other thing I would say about that is it's my understanding that the structure of licenses for fishing is held quite differently in far shore rather than near shore, right? So the kind of coordination issues with local communities would become less complex as you move further away, and so that might help. Even though it's not a fully mature technology as we stand today, that the expectation is that it will be, and we've done some work in that area that would suggest that people's expectations certainly are that it's going to be cost competitive long run. And I think that those kind of local coordination issues would be more easily resolved as you move further offshore. So look, it's a long-term positive, but it's also a long game. I'm a huge fan, and I think that it's going to be a really important part of Japan's long-term decarbonisation scenario.
And they're also in the midst of overhauling the kind of assessment criteria because one party won the first round of auctions in their entirety. So, and that's kind of an inevitable part of the process, right? That you tweak the rules as you go through these auctions and you learn about the bidders and the cost structure and all those kind of things as well. So I think it will be interesting to see how that plays out.
Absolutely, yes.
Well, and that's been absolutely terrific. Maybe one final question, which we ask all our guests. Who do you read or listen to? And maybe let's keep it to Japan in the energy space that you think is always good, thought-provoking and relevant to your work.
Yeah, great question. I've heard your previous podcast where you've you asked this of folks. So one of the things, of course, is language, right? So accessing Japanese language makes a big difference to the types of information sources that you're able to obtain. There are a number of really terrific people. So I mentioned earlier the study done between Berkeley and Enron, led by Shiraishi Kenji, looking at decarbonization scenarios for the power sector in Japan. It's available in both English and Japanese, and I recommend that folk download that and take a look at it. It's been getting quite a bit of press, and it provides us a different kind of proposed picture of what renewables could do within the decarbonization space in Japan relative to, let's say, the central scenario which the government is using within its planning, right? Someone who I follow a lot is a guy called Yasuda Yo, and I'm saying these in the Japanese way with a family name first, who's down at Kyoto University. He's terrific and I think really worth reading. The Institute for Energy Economics Japan produces a lot of work. Some of their modeling work, is used in Japan's decarbonization planning within government. So I think they're a very, very important entity. The Renewable Energy Institute, or REI, Obayashi Mika, for example, is in there. That's an independent research institute. That there've been historically not enough of those, and so they've been playing, I think, an increasingly important role within Japan. There are a couple of others maybe I would mention. Firstly, on nuclear issues, Suzuki Tatsujiro. So Suzuki-san is now at Nagasaki University, but he was formerly the vice chair, I think it is, of the Japan Atomic Energy Commission. And really, I think one of Japan's wisest long-term kind of analysts of nuclear power within Japan. And lastly, I would mention the work done out of the University of Tokyo by Sugiyama Masahiro, who is an MIT-trained guy, but he works with integrated assessment models and is particularly doing a lot of work in model intercomparison. So they're kind of looking at 2050 decarbonization scenarios across the economy to look at what is robust to different model specifications and so on, but really smart work, and I think worth paying attention to as well.
That's an awesome and very thoughtful list. I've certainly been taking detailed notes there. And as you say, that NREL Berkeley paper is excellent, and we've certainly looked into it in detail. Llewelyn, thanks enormously for your time. We've covered a huge amount there, and we're incredibly grateful. All the best, and thank you again.
Thanks to you both.
That was Professor Llewelyn Hughes from the Australian National University, talking to Hugo Batten, Aurora's Managing Director for APAC and California, and Rowan von Spreckelsen, who heads Aurora's entry in new markets across APAC. Do keep an eye on our podcast feed for more in-depth conversations with senior members of the energy industry. The best way to do this is to subscribe on whatever platform you use. Thanks for listening, and goodbye.